This presentation is designed to guide you through understanding leases in real estate. Over the next 11 slides, we will break down the different types of leases, making what can often seem complex much simpler. Our goal is to clarify key concepts so you feel confident navigating lease agreements and their various forms. Let's dive in and make leases feel straightforward and approachable. A lease is essentially a legal contract that grants a tenant the right to use a property for a specific period of time in exchange for payment. Think of it like a rule book that clearly defines who can use the property, for how long, and under what conditions. At its core, a lease spells out several key elements. First, the duration. That's how long the tenant is allowed to occupy the space. Next are the tenant's obligations, which include rules about how the property should be used, maintained, and any other responsibilities the tenant must fulfill. Then, there are the landlord's rights, detailing what the property owner can enforce according to the agreement. Finally, payment terms are laid out, covering the rent amount, when it's due, and any additional charges. All of these components together ensure both parties understand their rights and duties during the lease period. What makes a gross lease best known is its predictability when it comes to monthly rent. With this type of lease, the tenant pays one fixed amount each month, which covers rent and typically includes expenses like taxes, insurance, and maintenance. This setup offers a simple starting point for both the landlord and the tenant because it bundles most property costs into a single payment. The biggest advantage here is that tenants face fewer surprises when it comes to unexpected fees, making budgeting much easier and more straightforward. Now, let's talk about net leases and how they relate to shared costs. In a net lease, the tenant takes on a bit more responsibility compared to a standard lease. Specifically, the tenant pays a base rent, but on top of that, they're also responsible for additional charges related to property's operating costs. These operating costs typically include property taxes, insurance, and maintenance expenses. This type of lease arrangement is more common in commercial real estate settings than in residential leases. So essentially, the tenant shares the financial burden of keeping the property running smoothly, which is why it's called a net lease involving shared costs. Here, we're looking at the concept of a triple net lease, which is a common arrangement in commercial real estate. Essentially, the tenant is responsible not only for paying rent, but also for three additional costs: property taxes, building insurance, and common area maintenance. This setup is beneficial because it clearly outlines which expenses the tenant covers, creating a transparent and balanced financial structure. By sharing these costs, landlords can reduce their overhead, while tenants gain a clear understanding of their total financial commitments. Overall, the triple net lease provides a straightforward and widely used framework for commercial property leasing. Here we see how rent structures can be linked to sales performance, making it a win-win situation for both landlords and tenants. The key idea here is that rent isn't just a fixed number. Instead, the tenant pays a base rent, which provides a steady income for the landlord, plus a percentage of their sales once revenue starts coming in. This means when the store does well and sales go up, the rent can also increase accordingly. This setup is very retail friendly because it shares both the risks and the rewards. If the tenant sales are strong, the landlord benefits from higher rent, creating an incentive for both parties to succeed. This model is common in malls and other retail spaces, where aligning interests helps foster a healthier, more collaborative relationship between landlords and tenants. Essentially, it's a flexible approach that ties rent payments to business performance, making it fairer and more dynamic. Let's break down the expense breakdown in a typical commercial lease. The base rent usually covers the core occupancy costs, meaning the essential amount you pay to lease the space itself. Often, property taxes and building insurance are included in this base rent, but sometimes they might be billed separately based on your share of the building. This helps keep budgeting straightforward for tenants. Common area maintenance, or CM, which includes light upkeep and shared area costs, is often passed through to tenants. These costs are usually split among tenants and can be billed back either monthly or annually. Utilities and smaller spaces might be included if they're individually metered, but more often they're separate charges. Repairs can vary. Major building repairs might be the tenant's responsibility, depending on the lease terms, but interior or minor fixes frequently remain with the landlord. The way expenses are split really depends on the specific lease. For example, in a modified gross lease, base rent covers some costs while others are shared or billed separately. It's a flexible middle ground between a full gross lease and a net lease, with part of the expenses bundled and part passed through. Overall, you'll often see one main rent payment with a few shared costs added on, tailored to fit both landlord and tenant needs. Here we have an example of a graduated lease schedule. This type of lease is designed so that the rent increases on a predetermined timeline, typically every year or every few years. In this example, the rent starts at $2,000 in the first year. Then, it gradually increases to $2,100 in year 2, $2,200 in year 3, and $2,350 in year 4. This gradual increase is intentional and helps both the landlord and tenant plan their finances more effectively. The annual rent escalation acts as a step-by-step growth, reflecting inflation, property value increases, or agreed-upon adjustments. By outlining these predictable increases in advance, the tenant knows exactly what to expect each year, and the landlord ensures the rent keeps pace with market changes. When we compare residential and commercial leases, there are a few key differences to keep in mind. Residential leases tend to be more structured, with shorter terms and stronger tenant protections built in. These leases use more standardized forms, which makes them less flexible but more straightforward for tenants. On the other hand, commercial leases offer much greater flexibility. They often have longer lease terms and fewer built-in protections for tenants. Because commercial leases are more negotiable, both landlords and tenants have more room to customize the agreement based on their specific needs. So essentially, the biggest differences revolve around the duration of the lease, the level of tenant protections, and the degree of flexibility in negotiations. Residential leases follow a more uniform set of rules, while commercial leases provide more opportunities to tailor terms but come with less automatic protection for tenants. This difference reflects the distinct purposes and legal frameworks governing these two types of leases. Let's do a quick recap of the different lease types and how they affect who pays what. First, with a gross lease, the landlord covers most of property expenses, so the tenant generally just pays a fixed rent. Then, in a net lease, the tenant pays rent plus some property costs, like utilities or maintenance. Moving on to a triple net lease, here the tenant is responsible for property taxes, insurance, and maintenance in addition to rent. A percentage lease is a bit different. It includes rent based on a percentage of the tenant's sales, which is common in retail spaces. Lastly, there's a modified gross lease, where the landlord and tenant split expenses as agreed upon in the lease. The key takeaway here is to fully understand how the costs are divided before you sign any lease, so there are no surprises down the line. Now that we've covered the essentials, let's talk about the next practical steps. First, it's crucial to choose a lease type that aligns well with the property, the tenant's needs, and importantly, who is responsible for the various costs. You got the basics down, but before you sign anything, always review the lease carefully. It's a good idea to consult with a broker, agent, or attorney who can help confirm details around rent structure, expenses, and renewal terms. When you compare terms from different leases, do so with confidence, knowing you've done your homework. A helpful tip to keep in mind: always clarify exactly who will pay for taxes, insurance, and maintenance. And remember, if you have questions, ask them. That's the best way to achieve clarity and avoid surprises later on.